Today you'll learn the story of Emily, the young woman who was erased from her own life and re-emerged thanks to Ryan's courage, drama, injustice, and a rebirth that will leave you speechless. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this surprising story, please leave your feedback in the comments about where you're watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel. There are days when nothing seems to make sense, and Ryan Scott knew this better than anyone. That particular night had already begun with a dull ache in his chest, one of those that doesn't hurt but still squeezing. He found himself in the ballroom of a luxury hotel in Los Angeles, surrounded by people who smiled more with their lips than with their eyes, at another one of those charity dinners that seemed to be held only to feed the ego of those who donated, and not the hunger of those in need. Glasses clinking, rehearsed speeches about empathy, people applauding each other for being so good. Ryan listened to it all in silence, as always. But that day the apathy had given way to a greater tiredness. It was as if he felt suffocated by the expensive perfume, the warm lights, and the empty words. He left before dessert, took the car with his cold hands, and without programming the GPS drove through dark streets, his headlights cutting through the low fog that was beginning to cover the city. He didn't know exactly why he didn't go straight home. The penthouse where he lived was less than 15 minutes away, with automatic heating, a panoramic view of the city, and an absolute silence that had accompanied him for years. But that night, the idea of returning to that silence seemed worse than braving the cold. He walked along the busiest avenues, thoughtlessly crossed exclusive neighborhoods, and stopped in less lit areas, as if something inside him was searching for something he didn't even know what it was. The Echo Park neighborhood was quieter than usual. The wind whistled through the old buildings and the streetlights flickered as if they were about to go out. Ryan slowed down, the car sliding slowly on the wet asphalt. It was then that he heard a sound that didn't fit with the rest. A high-pitched scream, abruptly interrupted, coming from an alley on the left. At that instant he felt his stomach churn. He stopped the car immediately, like someone waking up with a start. He rolled down the window and looked toward the alley. Shadows enveloped almost everything, but his eyes took in enough to make his blood run cold. Two men were crouching over a woman on the ground. One was violently tugging at her bag, the other trying to hold her arms, preventing any reaction. The yellowish light from a broken streetlight flickered above them, as if in protest. Ryan didn't think to call for backup, nor did he question the danger. He simply shouted in a hoarse, firm voice, "I've already called the police. Get out of here now." The tone was that of someone giving orders, a tone he rarely used, but which in that moment emerged like a primitive instinct. The two men hesitated, glanced at each other quickly, and disappeared around the side of the alley. Ryan didn't get out of the car immediately. He held his breath for a few seconds as if his body was still processing what had happened. Only then did he unbuckle his seatbelt and get out, carefully stepping onto the wet ground. The woman was still on the pavement. Her blouse was torn, her pants dirty, and her knees scraped. Her face was partially covered by her hair, but a cut on her eyebrow and a bruise on her cheek were visible. Ryan approached cautiously, his hands raised, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "I don't want to hurt you," he said softly. "I want to help you. Are you okay?" She looked up with difficulty, trying to discern whether he was a threat or a savior. His gaze was hard but tired. "I'm still alive. That's something," she replied in a hoarse voice, almost without strength. It was a simple phrase, but laden with pain, spoken by someone who no longer expected anything from life. Ryan knelt beside her, not knowing what to do with his hands. He wasn't a doctor or a first responder, but he felt he couldn't leave her there. There was something about that woman that made it impossible for him to leave. Something about the way she remained upright, even when she was fallen, as if there was still a spark that no one had managed to completely extinguish. Ryan felt out of place. There he was, in a damp Los Angeles alley, kneeling next to a stranger, wondering why this moment felt more important than any business meeting he'd ever had. She tried to stand on her own, but her legs gave out. Hesitantly, he reached out his hand, and only after a few seconds did she accept the gesture. Her skin was cold, her fingers trembling, but the grip was firm. As she stood, she took a step back, keeping her distance, still wary. She looked around, as if afraid the Attackers would return, or worse, that something more terrible would happen. "Do you want me to drive you somewhere?" he asked, trying to appear less intimidating than her height and appearance suggested. She was slow to respond. "I can't go to the hospital. I can't give my name," she murmured, almost apologetic. Ryan didn't understand, but he didn't press the issue. He'd learned that sometimes silence speaks louder than insistence. The impulse came unfiltered. "You can go to my house. It's close. You can rest there, take a shower. Just for tonight." She looked up, surprised. Not surprised that someone would offer help, but that someone like him would offer it. Ryan sensed it instantly. His wet Italian shoes, the expensive coat, the car parked a few feet away. He represented exactly the kind of person she'd probably learned to distrust by now. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a little firmer, with an almost imperceptible tinge of irony. Ryan took a deep breath. Someone who's sick of watching this and pretending they didn't see anything. It was true. Not a rehearsed line, but a sincerity that surprised even him. For a moment, they were silent. Then she nodded slowly. It didn't seem like a vote of confidence, but perhaps one of exhaustion. Ryan walked her to the car, holding the umbrella over both of them, as if that gesture could protect her from more than just the rain. The drive to the apartment was silent, crossing dark avenues with the soft sound of the windshield wipers. Ryan looked in the rearview mirror, seeing his reflection in the back seat. His eyes fixed on the window, his breathing slow, as if he were in another world. He tried to think of something to say, but nothing seemed appropriate. He was nervous, and that was strange. Nervous about not knowing what to do, about not wanting to make a mistake with someone already hurt enough. When they reached the building, he offered his arm to help her up, but she refused. She wanted to stand, firm on her own. They went up in silence. The elevator, modern and mirrored, seemed like a space removed from reality. She glanced at her reflection and soon looked away. Ryan pretended not to have noticed. He opened the door to the apartment, turned on the lights, and took off his coat, trying to act naturally. "There are clean towels in the bathroom if you want to take a shower. And I left one of my shirts on the bed. You can use it." She didn't respond immediately. She walked slowly down the hallway, taking everything in like someone entering unfamiliar territory. While she showered, Ryan remained restless in the living room. He sat down, got up, went to the kitchen, and came back. The sound of running water seemed to fill the entire apartment. He tried not to think, but it was impossible. Why had he brought that woman home? What exactly had driven him to act like this? It wasn't compassion. It was something else. An identification, perhaps. A silent pain he couldn't explain. He remembered her face on the floor, the way she looked at him with distrust but without resentment, like someone used to being invisible, but who hasn't given up on being human. When she emerged, wrapped in her shirt, her hair still dripping, her face clean, Ryan felt a strange shock. She was different, not because she looked more put together, but because in that instant, she seemed like herself. She stopped at the entrance to the living room, took a deep breath, and said softly, "Thank you for not treating me like garbage." Ryan didn't know how to respond. He just nodded, swallowing his emotion. That wasn't just gratitude, but the kind of gratitude that only comes from someone who has been ignored too many times. Ryan offered her a cup of tea, but she declined with a slight gesture. Instead, she sat on the edge of the sofa, as if unsure of her right to occupy that space. He noticed and felt uncomfortable, not for her, but because he realized how hostile his house, filled with expensive furniture and silence, must have seemed to someone coming in off the street. "If you want to sleep, the room's yours. I'll stay here in the living room," he said, nodding his chin at his armchair. She nodded. He didn't ask why. He simply got up and walked slowly into the bedroom, shuffling slightly. Ryan turned off the lights, sat on the sofa, and remained there for hours, staring into space. He tried to understand why that encounter had moved him so much. It wasn't pity. He was never good at feigning solidarity. But there was something about that woman that unsettled him. The way she held his gaze, even wounded. The way she expressed her gratitude, not as a victim, but as someone who appreciated a simple gesture. When the silence finally lulled him to sleep, he fell asleep without realizing it. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in the kitchen. For a second, he thought it had all been a dream. But there she was, her hair carelessly tied back, his shirt rolled up at the cuffs, searching the cupboards for something. Ryan sat up, still dazed, and walked slowly in. "Good morning," he said, unsure if he was interrupting a moment. She turned around, her expression neutral but not hostile. "Is there any coffee?" she asked. He pointed to the coffee maker. "Yes, of course, you can use everything." She nodded. For a moment, there were no more words. He watched her prepare the coffee with precision, grinding the beans he didn't even remember buying, adjusting the water temperature, choosing a small cup, and refusing sugar. Good coffee doesn't need sugar. Colombian coffee is even better. Ryan raised his eyebrows in surprise. This wasn't just a casual observation, but one from someone who knows what they're doing. She wasn't what he'd initially thought. There was a calmness about her that was incompatible with the image of someone homeless. Later, Tyler arrived. He was the only friend Ryan had kept close over the years. Someone mocking, direct but trustworthy. Ryan had called him early on impulse, perhaps seeking a second opinion or simply needing to share his feelings. As he entered the apartment and saw the woman in the kitchen, Tyler let out a subdued whistle. "Did you rescue a cat from the trash or something?" she whispered in Ryan's ear, with that dry wit of hers. But before Ryan could reply, she turned, looked at him without hesitation, and said, "Do you want coffee?" Tyler choked. "Yes, please. If it's Colombian even." "Better," he replied, trying to break the ice. She handed him the cup, and for the first time she smiled slightly. It wasn't broad, but it was enough for Ryan to understand that despite her injuries, he was standing before a woman with presence. "I'm annoying, but not cruel," Tyler added, pointing to the bread she'd brought. "It's freshly baked. Eat it." She nodded in thanks. The kitchen fell silent but charged with meaning. Ryan noticed that the house no longer seemed so empty. Later, while Tyler was sipping his coffee on the terrace, Ryan found the woman in the apartment's small library. It was a space he almost never used. There she was, sitting on the floor with an open book in her lap, a volume of political philosophy in Old Spanish, filled with the underlining and annotations of someone with training. She seemed calm, absorbed. "Do you like to read?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I've always liked it. It helped me escape when I couldn't leave the house," she replied, without taking her eyes off the page. That's when she began to tell her story. Her name was Emily Collins, the daughter of an influential senator, and she had been erased from her own life. "The woman my father married after my mother died. She destroyed me. She falsified documents, manipulated him, and portrayed me as unstable. One day, everything was simply taken from me. My name, my house, my identity, even my birth certificate. I ceased to exist. I was buried alive," she said, her eyes fixed on the book but her voice trembling. Ryan fell silent, sat beside her, and held her hand. It was a simple gesture but full of meaning. For the first time, she didn't pull her hand away. Ryan stayed by her side for a long time without saying a word. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that sometimes presence is worth more than any speech. He listened to her breathing, felt the tension in her shoulders, and knew she carried not just pain, but a kind of shame, as if being discarded was her fault. She flipped through the book without really making any progress, perhaps to keep her hands busy and not give in to the memories. "Did you tell anyone?" he asked gently. Emily shook her head. No one would have believed it, and the few who could help were already on her side. Her voice was low but firm. Ryan thought about how many times he'd been in rooms with politicians like his father, men capable of manipulating everything, even their own children. He felt rage, a quiet, bitter rage, directed at this system he knew all too well. But there, beside her, he decided this wasn't a time for anger, but for listening. In the following days, Ryan tried to respect her space, but he couldn't help but lean in closer. He began to notice small details: how Emily tied her hair back practically, how she wiped her hands on her jeans when she was nervous, how she preferred silence to explanations. Tyler, on the other hand, insisted on making her smile. He brought different breads every day, invented nicknames, and complained about her supposed disorganization, which didn't really exist. "You're taming the lonely boar," he would say, pointing at Ryan, who just rolled his eyes. Little by little, Emily let down her guard. She still retreated into long silences, but she no longer jumped at every noise. One day they talked about music. He put on an old vinyl record, thinking she wouldn't notice, but she recognized the melody from the first chord. Chavela Vargas. This song reminds me of my mother." It was the first time he mentioned his mother. Ryan felt a lump in his throat and simply replied, "It had good taste." One day Ryan received an invitation to a gala. It would be a formal soiree, full of businessmen, politicians, and photographers. Something he usually avoided, but somehow now seemed necessary. He thought about taking Emily, not to show her off, but because he believed she needed to be seen in a different environment, outside of the role she'd been condemned to. When he proposed it to Tyler, he raised his eyebrows. "You want to take a woman who's been wearing your t-shirts for days to an event with this city's rotten elite?" Ryan shrugged. "She deserves to be wherever she wants." Tyler sighed dramatically. "Then leave it to me. Today, my friend, you'll be the fashion revenge of the century." Emily laughed incredulously. "You're joking." But Tyler wasn't. He showed up with clothes, makeup, and accessories. "Trust me, the only thing we're burying today is the image they created of you." Ryan watched from a distance as Emily transformed, not because of the makeup, but because of her posture. She looked at herself in the mirror like someone recognizing a dormant part of herself. As they entered the gala, they caused a sensation. The flashbulbs, the fake smiles, and the whispers were there, as always. Ryan walked up right beside Emily, who was wearing a sober but imposing dress, her hair elegantly tied back, and that same steady gaze. For a few minutes, everything went well. Courteous greetings, polite compliments, and curious glances, until a familiar voice cut through the air with venom. "She's dead. That's an imposter. A beggar in disguise." It was Isabel, the stepmother, impeccable, surrounded by people, her gaze fixed on Emily, as if she wanted to erase her on the spot. Emily froze. The crowd turned around. Ryan tried to intervene, but she was already trembling. She ran out of the hall, her eyes glassy and her body hunched over. Outside, the cold night seemed to mock her. "She's right, I shouldn't have come," she muttered, sitting down on the curb. Ryan knelt beside her, his suit brushing the wet floor. "You're wrong, Emily. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You just need to be you." Ryan was still on his knees when Emily raised her face, her eyes brimming with tears, but her expression hardened. It wasn't anger, but something deeper, a shame planted deep within her that bubbled up every time she tried to be reborn. He held her hand and she didn't withdraw. They remained silent for a few minutes until she whispered, "You should have left me that night." Ryan shook his head. "If I had left you, you wouldn't have shown me true strength." Emily looked away, but a slight tremor in her lips revealed that her defenses were giving way. When she returned home, she locked herself in her bedroom. Ryan spent the early morning in the living room staring at the ceiling, and it was in that early morning that he decided he would no longer be a mere spectator in his life. He couldn't bring back the past, but he could fight to ensure that the present wasn't stolen from him. The next day, without saying anything to Emily, Ryan canceled his multi-million-dollar donation to the foundation chaired by Isabel. What's more, he published a public statement, signed with his first and last name, and EIN, stating that he would not support institutions that manipulate images for their own benefit. The news spread like wildfire. He knew there would be consequences, that the elite he now avoided would see him as a traitor, but he didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he was doing something he truly believed in. Later, Emily read the note alone in her bedroom. She said nothing. She just put her phone aside and cried silently. It wasn't because of the money, but because someone had stood by her without asking for anything in return. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. But the fear, that old fear, still lingered. And when Ryan woke up the next day, he found only a note written in firm, brief handwriting. "This is not my place. I'm sorry for messing up yours." That morning was one of the most desperate of Ryan's life. Not because she was gone, but because he didn't know where to look for her. He called Tyler, his contacts, even hospitals, to no avail. He spent 2 days following any lead. Then he received an unexpected call from a shelter on the city's south side. "There's a young woman here. She came in weak, alone. She gave your number, said you were someone who cares." Ryan drove without thinking. Upon arriving, a woman with gray hair and a frank look greeted him. "It's Martha. She's inside." She came in trembling, feverish, but she didn't ask for anything, just silence. Ryan entered and saw her lying in a narrow cot, covered to the neck, her face pale, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. He approached, slowly, and held her hand just as before. "You won't fall again. I'm here, forever if you'll let me." Doña Martha from the doorway murmured, "This girl's heart is in pieces," but she never once pouted. Emily was slow to wake up. It was 2 days of fever and troubled dreams. Ryan stayed there the whole time. He helped with bandages, made soup with Mrs. Martha, and cleaned the room. It was in that simple setting, with peeling walls and the smell of tea, that she understood the true extent of her strength. Despite her weakness, Emily tried to help other women in the shelter, asked their names and listened to their stories. She never complained. When she finally opened her eyes and saw Ryan holding her hand, she just murmured, "Are you still here?" He smiled without responding. There was no need. In the following days, with more calm, she regained color. And as she regained strength, Tyler appeared with a thick envelope in his hands and a strange gleam in his eyes. "Well, friends, it seems we have here the official rebirth of Emily Collins." It was just what Ryan had hoped. Documents, audio recordings, photos, signatures, proof of her identity. But Emily hesitated. "I'm scared. When I wanted to tell them, no one believed me." Ryan held his gaze firmly. "Now you have proof, and you have me." With the documents in hand, the truth stopped being a persistent memory and became something demonstrable. Still, Emily hesitated. Ryan saw in her eyes the conflict between the impulse for justice and the fear of being called crazy again. "What if I go up on that stage and they call me crazy again?" she asked one night over soup at Doña Martha's house. Ryan replied calmly, "The difference is that now, when you go up there, you won't be alone." That made all the difference. It was no longer about proving something to the world, but about having someone willing to support you. Tyler, always direct, added, "And if anyone doubts it, I'll let it all out live, without mercy." She smiled for the first time in days. It was shy, but genuine. It was a Friday night when Emily made her decision. She put on a simple white blouse, tied her hair back with an old elastic, and took a deep breath before entering the studio of the most watched program in the country. Ryan and Tyler were in the front row of the audience, attentive. When she was introduced, no one knew who she was, but when she began to speak, no one looked away. "My name is Emily Collins. Yes, the one who was once, the daughter of Senator Richard Collins. But I ceased to exist when they tried to silence me. They falsified records. They kicked me out of the house where I was born. They stole my identity. They accused me of being dead. But I survived. No name, no titles, nothing. Only the dignity that no one could take away from me." The silence was absolute, as if each word broke through a layer of lies built over her for years. Outside, Isabel watched the show from a private box, alongside her lawyers and allies. She tried to contact production, threatened lawsuits, and even pretended to cry on camera. "She's unstable. This is dangerous. She has no proof." But Tyler, true to his word, had already launched a live stream with over 500,000 viewers. He showed documents, audio recordings of conversations, screenshots of Isabel's emails manipulating witnesses, and hush money orders. "Those tears of hers are faker than a spray tan," he commented sarcastically. The internet exploded. Emily became a headline. But more than an heiress, she became a symbol. The woman reborn after being buried alive by those who were supposed to protect her. 2 days later, after multiple complaints and evidence presented to the county attorney's office, Isabel was remanded in custody. Emily was summoned as the main witness. Her name was returned to the civil registry. Her identity was restored, and the frozen inheritance was unblocked. But what shocked everyone was what she did next. She gathered Ryan, Tyler, Martha, and some women from the shelter in her father's old living room. "I don't want fortune. I want dignity. And I want no woman to go through what I went through without having a place to fall, a place to breathe, a place to be reborn." Thus was born the Concrete Flowers Project, a network of shelters for women in situations of abandonment or violence, funded by the inheritance she swore never to touch. At the inauguration of the first house, it was Martha who cut the ribbon, her eyes glassy. This girl didn't just save herself, she saved us too. The days following the opening of Concrete Flowers were intense and transformative, not only for Emily but for those who followed her journey. The simple house in downtown Los Angeles, with freshly painted walls and the smell of fresh paint, began to welcome women whose stories were as deeply rooted as hers. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters who had lost everything, except the desire to try again. Emily spoke with each one, listening intently and remembering their names and voices. She kept a notebook where she jotted down details. Who liked hibiscus tea, who was afraid of thunderstorms, or who cried at night. It was the care she would have longed for when no one believed in her. Ryan watched her with silent admiration. Sometimes he helped set up shelves or organize donations, not saying much but always attentive. At night they returned home together, not speaking of the past, preferring the present. Their coexistence became increasingly natural and intimate, but unhurried. Ryan never pressured her or invaded her space. He simply took care of small details, leaving her favorite mug of hot water in the morning or preparing the playlist she enjoyed. They created a silent and beautiful routine. On weekends they cooked simple meals together, pasta with vegetables, homemade bread, or omelets. Tyler sometimes appeared with cakes he claimed to have made himself, although they clearly came from a bakery. This girl became a national hero and still puts up with my jokes. She's stronger than I thought, he said with veiled pride. The press was still in pursuit of Emily, but she limited her appearances. I've been invisible for too long, now I just want to be me. Their story had served its purpose. Now she wanted to live it. One quiet evening, Ryan prepared a candlelit dinner, an unexpectedly romantic gesture from him. Emily arrived, her clothes wrinkled, her hair carelessly tied, back and carrying a bag of fruit. Seeing the table, she paused. "What's this?" she asked suspiciously but smiling. It's just a Tuesday," he replied, somewhat embarrassed. During dinner, he hesitated several times before taking a small box from his pocket containing a simple diamond-free and glittering wedding band. "I don't own a castle, Emily, but I do have love and a great desire to share my life with you, no matter what." She remained silent, looked at the ring with moist eyes, put the bag aside, took a deep breath and said, "Living with you is worth more than any inheritance." They didn't have a wedding with a party. No white dress, no altar. They did choose to share what truly mattered. Together, they bought a small house in Eagle Rock, with a garden, a makeshift vegetable garden, and a hammock between two pine trees. The house was simple, with a wooden floor, light-colored curtains, and the constant scent of coffee. Emily continued with concrete flowers, visiting homes on foot or by metro, wearing worn sneakers and carrying a cloth bag that held everything, except her vanity. Ryan became involved in social work at local churches, serving soup alongside Martha and Tyler, who was now practically family. Sometimes the three of them would laugh in the kitchen until Emily left the room to see what was happening. Life wasn't perfect, but it was alive, built with love, simplicity, and respect. Just what she had always longed for. One ordinary day, the news arrived that changed everything. Without warning or ceremony, Emily had been experiencing discomfort in recent months, persistent fatigue, mild abdominal pain, and dizziness, which she attributed to stress and the pace of her work. But that day, after another visit to the shelter, she nearly fainted on the subway. Ryan, concerned, went to pick her up and insisted on taking her to the hospital. "Don't exaggerate. It must just be low blood pressure." She tried to downplay it, but he was unwavering. In a cold room smelling of disinfectant, the doctor showed the tests with a face too serious to be routine. "We've found a nodule, Emily. We need to investigate it thoroughly." She listened calmly, as if she were talking about someone else. Ryan, at her side, squeezed her hand, trying not to show panic, but internally, she felt the ground give way. In the following days came consultations, biopsies, and exhaustive tests, and with them, confirmation. It was cancer. Early, with a good chance of treatment, but the word hurt, more from the illness itself than from remembering everything she'd already overcome. Just now, she murmured to herself at the edge of the bed. She wasn't crying, but her body was tense, refusing to accept another battle. Ryan sat down next to her, rested his head on her shoulder, and stayed there. "I'm with you. This doesn't change anything. It'll just bring us closer together." She smiled weakly, but sincerely. "I'm tired, Ryan," he answered without hesitation. "Then I'll carry you." Emily began treatment days later. She lost hair and weight, but never the firmness in her gaze. She continued to follow her project, albeit from a distance, and visited the shelter whenever her body allowed. The women of Concrete Flowers began sending her letters, videos, and drawings of support. That sustained her. Martha began sleeping at the house some nights, helping with teas, blankets, and home remedies. Tyler, who always used humor as a shield, once cried secretly in the bathroom and was discovered by Emily, who only said, "Even you have a heart, huh?" He kissed her forehead and left grumbling. The apartment took on a quieter rhythm. The mornings were slow, the days heavy, but filled with care. Ryan learned to prepare varied soups, to measure her temperature, and to recognize the signs of fatigue before she expressed them. And despite the pain, the nausea, and the limitations, a new tenderness blossomed between them. They didn't talk about the future. They lived in the present. Sometimes they would lie on the sofa in silence, listening to the wind in the window. In that silence was everything that words couldn't express. Love made of gestures and presences. Emily spent 2 months in intensive care. Her hair fell out almost completely, and she began wearing a colorful scarf Tyler had brought back on a trip, a symbol of her struggle. One day, looking in the mirror, she said, "See, Ryan? Now I really look like a warrior in uniform." He, with moist eyes, replied, "You always were. You just changed the armor." Subsequent tests showed remarkable improvement. The tumor was receding. The doctor smiled for the first time in weeks. "The news is very good." Ryan cried. Emily did too, but not from despair, but from relief and gratitude. That day she asked to visit the shelter, despite medical advice. She arrived by subway, as always. She entered the room and was greeted with applause, hugs, and tears. Each woman knew what she had been through. "We didn't survive alone," Emily said in a firm voice. "We held onto each other's hands, and you held me up when I thought I would fall." After that visit, something changed in Emily. It wasn't euphoria or forced optimism, but a serene acceptance. She understood that life can't always be controlled and that there are good and bad days, but that she had built a solid foundation that wouldn't allow her to collapse. At home, she went back to tending her plants, answering letters, and planning new locations for her project. Ryan watched her with affection and attention, aware of her fragility and determined not to let go of her for even a second. When the doctor confirmed her complete remission, Ryan cried more than she did. Emily took his hand firmly. "Now we start again." For the third time, he smiled silently. "As many as it takes." For Emily's birthday, she wanted something simple. No parties or expensive gifts. She just asked to go to the orphanage where she'd lived after being presumed dead. Ryan hesitated, fearing it would be painful, but understood that for her, it meant closing a cycle. Upon arrival, they were greeted by a coordinator who remembered that quiet teenager from years past. The girls surrounded her, drawings in their hands and requesting stories. Emily sat on the floor with them, her scarf blowing in the wind, a light cotton dress, and a calm smile. "Do you want a true story? Then sit down, everyone. There's no prince or fairy godmother, but there's courage, and a little girl who thought she was a mistake, until someone saw her and reminded her she was still alive." Ryan, leaning against the wall, listened with moist eyes. Their return that night was silent. The sky was clear, and the wind blew through the car window. Emily squeezed Ryan's hand, interlacing their fingers as if to engrave everything they'd experienced into his skin. When they got home, they didn't turn on all the lights. They sat on the terrace covered with a light blanket, gazing at the starry sky. "After all, I thought I'd never be happy again," she whispered. "Me neither," he replied without thinking. "Until I found you." The silence returned, but it was a complete silence, charged with something that needed no words. They were there, alive and rebuilt, side by side, not as savior and rescued, but as two people who chose to stay when everything seemed to suggest giving up. And that choice was, for both of them, more valuable than any promise. Little by little, the routine fell back into place. Ryan, who had previously only frequented corporate settings, now served soup on cold nights alongside Martha at city churches. Tyler, always irreverent, became an informal sponsor to the new residents of Flores de Concreto, bringing pastries, donated clothing, and sometimes stories so exaggerated that even the most reserved among us laughed. Emily resumed her weekly visits to the shelter, now more calmly and respecting her body, but never losing her. tenderness in listening and welcoming. Sometimes, while taking the subway with her cloth bag over her shoulder, someone would recognize her. "You're the woman from TV, right?" And she would always respond with the same calm, "I'm just someone who never ceased to exist." And she continued on her way, knowing that the greatest strength lies in being present, not in appearing. At the end of the year, the Los Angeles City Council invited her to receive a tribute for the social impact of concrete flowers. The event was broadcast live with speeches, a medal presentation, and a printing press. Ryan was apprehensive. He knew how much Emily shunned the spotlight. But when he asked her if she really wanted to go, she responded firmly, "I want to go, not for me, but for every woman who has lived her entire life being told she was worthless." And that day, she took the stage wearing a simple light blue dress Martha sewed for the occasion, a headscarf, and modest shoes. She held the microphone and said, "We learn to survive when no one wants to hear our voice, but surviving isn't enough. You have to live. And to live, sometimes all it takes is someone to say, 'I believe in you.'" The entire audience stood in applause. Ryan looked at her, his chest puffed out. After the tribute, invitations to interviews, conferences, and television programs poured in. Emily turned most of them down. She felt her story had served its purpose, and now she wanted to help other stories emerge. At Flores de Concreto, she formed a small support group made up of veteran women from the home, encouraging them to share their journeys. She said it wasn't a therapy group, but a real one, to remind us that we are flesh, not wounds. She also began writing short stories that she posted on the mural at the entrance, signing herself only EC. Many residents discovered the meaning of the acronym later. And yet, she continued taking the subway, carrying reusable bags, an old cell phone in her pocket, and always keeping an eye out for anyone who needed to be seen. At home, life with Ryan stabilized into a rhythm neither of them knew they desired, but which today they wouldn't trade for anything. They got up early, had breakfast together, and shared the household chores. He read the news aloud to her while she ate breakfast and calmly combed her hair. Sometimes they argued about politics, other times about the best way to cook rice, and in those small daily debates, they discovered even more camaraderie. Ryan smiled frequently again. The rigidity of a businessman dissolved over time. He learned to leave the windows open, to leave books stacked in every corner, and to cook without following recipes. And all of that had a name: Emily. She, without realizing it, showed him that love doesn't arrive with fireworks, but is built in silences, in a touch when pouring coffee, in the care of words, and in staying when everything seems to fall apart. One spring afternoon, Emily and Ryan returned to the alley where it all began. The same corner, the same streetlight that sometimes flickered. They sat on the curb with 2 coffees from the neighboring bakery. They didn't talk much. They just looked around in silence, remembering that night their paths crossed by chance, or by fate. "If someone had told me back then everything that was coming, I would have laughed in their face," Emily said with a faint laugh. Ryan smiled. "I probably would have told them to shut up." And they laughed together, like 2 survivors who know they don't need certainties, only each other's presence. They stayed there until dark and then walked slowly home, aware that what's truly important takes time. On the first anniversary of Concrete Flowers' opening, Emily organized a modest event: live music, a community cake, and a tree where each woman hung a ribbon with a word: courage, reunion, dignity, hope. The ribbon from a young newcomer touched her the most. It read, "I still don't know who I am, but here I can find out." Emily treasured the ribbon and placed it in a frame next to a photo of the first house dedicated. That evening, as she gathered the chairs in the living room with Ryan, she stopped, looked around, and whispered, "I never imagined that from the bottom of the pit we could build foundations for so many good things." Ryan replied, "You just didn't know how strong you are." She pulled him by his shirt, rested her head on his chest, and right there, they danced slowly, to the music still playing outside. The following weeks remained serene until one day Emily received a handwritten letter from the penitentiary. It was from Isabel. The handwriting was shaky, and the content was brief. She asked for forgiveness. There were no justifications or lengthy apologies. Just one sentence: "I'm sorry for erasing you." Emily kept the letter silently, and to this day she doesn't know if she ever fully forgave her. but she tore the sheet of paper into pieces and threw it in the trash. Not out of revenge, but because that chapter had already come to an end. What mattered now was what was to come. Life, full of people, stories, and second chances. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. The ability to be reborn, no matter how many times, as long as there is love and the courage to continue. And so, within the simple walls of a house that smelled of freshly baked bread, in the hallways of a shelter filled with women's voices and hope, in a shared gaze, in the silence of the early morning, or in the grip of one hand that never lets go of the other, it was there that Emily was reborn, not as anyone's daughter, not as a victim of anything, but as herself, whole, authentic, and the master of her own story. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.